I never meant for it to happen. I never thought I'd be the type of person who would betray their partner. But life has a way of throwing you into situations where the lines blur, where mistakes seem like choices and choices feel like they're out of your control. That's how it happened at the company party. It was supposed to be a fun, light-hearted night. The annual corporate gala, an event everyone looked forward to, especially after a long year. My husband, Mike, was supposed to come, but at the last minute he had to stay home with the kids. I could have skipped the event too, but he insisted I go, that I deserved a night out. "Go, have fun," he said, kissing me goodbye. "You've worked hard this year. Enjoy yourself." I smiled, thanked him, and promised to be home early. But part of me was excited for a night away. I loved Mike. I loved our life, but the constant cycle of work, family, and responsibilities had taken its toll. A night to let loose, to remember the person I was before I became a wife and mom. That sounded appealing. When I arrived at the venue, the atmosphere was electric. The decorations were over the top, the drinks were flowing, and my coworkers, who were usually buttoned up in their cubicles, were laughing, dancing, and letting go. I was greeted with warmth and excitement, the kind that makes you feel like you belong. The night started off perfectly. Drinks with friends, casual conversations with colleagues, and a few harmless compliments about how good I looked. And then there was him, Ryan, a coworker I'd known for years. We weren't close, but we'd always gotten along well enough. He was charming, funny, and always seemed to have the entire office's attention when he spoke. I didn't think much of it when we started talking. We chatted about work, joked about office gossip, and complained about the bosses. All harmless. But as the drinks kept coming, the conversation became more personal. We were both a little tipsy, the alcohol making everything feel lighter, easier. His compliments became more frequent, and at first I brushed them off. But soon something shifted. "Wow, Sarah, I never realized how beautiful you are," Ryan said, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made me feel both flattered and uncomfortable. I laughed it off, trying to keep things light. "Well, I'm usually in boring office clothes." "No, it's not just that," he said, leaning in closer. "There's something about you tonight." His words, combined with the alcohol, made my head spin. It was a rush of attention I hadn't felt in years. I knew I should have walked away, should have stopped whatever was happening before it went further. But in that moment, I didn't. I liked the way he looked at me. I liked feeling desired again. The night wore on, and before I knew it, we were dancing. I told myself it was innocent, just two coworkers having fun. But as the music got louder, the lights dimmer, and our bodies closer, I realized how dangerous this was becoming. I wasn't in control anymore. Ryan's hand slid around my waist, and I didn't push it away. The heat between us was undeniable, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was caught in it. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "Let's get some air." I should have said no. I should have stopped it right there. But instead, I nodded, and we walked outside to the patio. The cool night air hit me as we stepped outside, and for a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. I should have used that moment to come to my senses, to pull away and walk back inside. But Ryan was standing so close, his eyes full of intent, and the alcohol clouded my judgment. The guilt hadn't hit yet. All I could feel was the adrenaline coursing through me. We stood by the railing, looking out at the city lights, our shoulders brushing. There was a silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, thick with the tension of what was about to happen. I knew it, he knew it, but neither of us stopped it. "I've always liked you, you know," Ryan said softly, his voice low. "There's something about you, Sarah. I've always wondered what it would be like to get to know you better." My heart raced, and I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out strained. "Ryan, you're married." "I'm married. This isn't a good idea." But even as I said the words, I didn't move away. I didn't stop him when he turned toward me, his hand gently brushing my arm. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with desire. "But we're here now. Just one night, no one has to know. One night." Those words echoed in my mind, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him. His lips met mine in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and filled with a kind of intensity that I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, I knew that, but in that moment it didn't feel wrong. It felt exhilarating. What happened next was a blur. A blur of hands, lips, and whispered promises of secrecy. We found ourselves in one of the quiet corners of the venue, hidden away from the rest of the party. In the haze of it all, I let go of every thought about Mike, about my family, and let myself get swept up in the moment. When it was over, when the passion finally subsided, reality hit me like a freight train. I pulled away from Ryan, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with the enormity of what I had just done. Couldn't look at him, couldn't speak. The guilt flooded me instantly, drowning out any of the excitement or thrill that had brought me to this point. "I have to go," I muttered, my voice shaking. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my things and rushed out of the venue, not even bothering to say goodbye to anyone else. As I stepped into the cold night, the weight of what I had done crashed down on me. I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. The drive home felt like the longest of my life. My mind replayed every moment of the night, and with each passing second, the guilt twisted tighter in my chest. How could I have done this? How could I have betrayed Mike, the man who trusted me, who loved me? When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the darkened house. The kids were asleep. Mike was probably waiting up for me like he always did when I went out. I didn't deserve that. I didn't deserve him. I finally forced myself out of the car and walked inside. Mike was sitting on the couch, reading a book, his face lighting up when he saw me. He smiled, the kind of smile that used to make me feel warm and safe, but now it only made me feel sick. "Hey, how was the party?" he asked, setting the book aside and walking over to kiss me. I flinched, stepping back slightly, and I saw the confusion in his eyes. "It was fine," I muttered, trying to avoid his gaze. Mike frowned but didn't push. "You okay? You seem off." "I'm just tired," I lied, forcing a weak smile. "I think I'll head to bed." He nodded, clearly sensing something was wrong but letting it go. "All right, I'll be up soon." As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, the guilt weighed heavier on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just thrown everything away. My marriage, my family, the life we had built together. All for one stupid, meaningless mistake. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's face, felt his hands on me, and the guilt would twist tighter until I thought I might choke on it. I wanted to tell Mike the truth, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the thought of seeing the hurt in his eyes, of losing him, was unbearable. So I kept it to myself. I buried the truth deep inside, hoping that somehow, with enough time, the guilt would fade, and I could forget what had happened. But the guilt didn't fade. It only grew. The days that followed were torturous. Every time Mike kissed me or told me he loved me, the guilt gnawed at me like a relentless ache. I couldn't shake the memory of that night, couldn't escape the overwhelming regret that consumed me. I felt like a stranger in my own home, constantly on edge, terrified that Mike would somehow figure out what I had done. Ryan thankfully didn't reach out. We saw each other at work, but it was always in passing, a quick nod or polite smile, as though nothing had ever happened. But the tension between us was palpable, and every time I saw him, I felt the weight of my betrayal crushing me all over again. I tried to act normal, to pretend like everything was fine, but Mike could tell something was off. He asked me about it a few times, his concern evident in his voice, but I always brushed it off, blaming stress or exhaustion. I knew he didn't believe me, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I was too scared of what it would do to us, what it would do to him. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Mike reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know something's been bothering you. You've been distant and I don't know why, but I just want you to know I'm here. Whatever it is, we can get through it." His words broke me. Tears filled my eyes, and I had to fight to keep from completely falling apart. I didn't deserve his kindness, his patience, his love. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and here he was, offering me understanding. "I'm fine," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm just tired." Mike looked at me, his eyes filled with concern, but he didn't push any further. He simply pulled me into his arms and held me close, and I felt the guilt nearly suffocate me. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, drowning in guilt and regret. I had to let it go. I had to bury the memory of that night and focus on what really mattered. My marriage, my family, the life Mike and I had built together. I had made a terrible mistake, but I wasn't going to let it destroy everything. I wasn't going to let it define me. From that moment on, I vowed to be the wife Mike deserved, to never let anything come between us again. I couldn't change the past, but I could control the future. And in the future, I would never make a mistake like that again. Making the decision to move on from that night was one thing, but actually living with it was something else entirely. Every day, I tried to focus on my marriage, to put all my energy into being the best wife I could be for Mike. I showered him with affection, planned little surprises for him, and tried to make up for the distance I had created. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the guilt. It haunted me. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that evening at the corporate party. I'd ask myself over and over, why? Why had I let it happen? Why hadn't I stopped it before it went too far? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how easy it had been to lose control in that moment, and that terrified me. Mike noticed the change in me. Despite my efforts to act normal, he could sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the guilt that was eating away at me. It was the fear that one day he would figure it out, that he would look at me and know what I had done. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, Mike came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He kissed my neck softly and whispered, "You've been distant lately. Are you sure everything's okay?" I froze for a moment, his warmth and affection making the guilt rise up like bile in my throat. I had no idea how he hadn't figured it out yet, how he hadn't seen right through me. But I couldn't confess. I couldn't bring myself to shatter the life we had built, not when I was trying so hard to move past it. "I'm fine," I whispered, trying to sound convincing. "I've just had a lot on my mind with work." He turned me around to face him, his hands gently holding my shoulders. "You know I'm here for you, right? Whatever it is, we can get through it together." I looked into his eyes, those kind, trusting eyes, and felt my heart break all over again. How could I have done this to him? How could I have betrayed someone who loved me so deeply? "I know," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "I love you, Mike, more than anything." He smiled, pulling me into his arms. "I love you too." As he held me close, I told myself again that I could get through this. I could move on. I could be the wife Mike deserved, even if I didn't feel like I deserved him. But deep down, I knew the guilt wasn't going to just disappear. It was a part of me now, a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. Despite my efforts to move on, there was one person who kept dragging me back to that night, Ryan. At work, we kept our distance. It was as though we had made an unspoken agreement to pretend nothing had ever happened, to act like we were just co-workers. But every time I saw him, Every time I passed him in the hallway or caught a glimpse of him in a meeting, I was reminded of what I had done. I hated the way my heart raced whenever I saw him, the way my mind flashed back to that night. I hated that I couldn't escape it, and I hated that, deep down, a part of me was still drawn to him. One afternoon, after a particularly stressful meeting, I found myself alone in the office break room, staring out the window and trying to calm my racing thoughts. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, and before I could turn around, Ryan was there, standing next to me. "Hey," he said quietly. I froze, my body tense with a mixture of guilt and nerves. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I didn't want to talk to him, didn't want to acknowledge what had happened, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it forever. Finally, Ryan spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the party." My heart pounded in my chest, and I turned to face him, my voice shaking. "Ryan, we shouldn't be talking about this. It was a mistake, and it should have never happened." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know. I didn't mean for it to get out of hand either. But I can't stop thinking about it, and I can tell it's been weighing on you too." I felt a surge of frustration. Of course it's been weighing on me. I betrayed my husband, Ryan. I'm trying to move past it, to fix my marriage, and I don't need you reminding me of what I did. Ryan looked taken aback by my outburst, but he didn't back down. "I'm not trying to make things harder for you, Sarah, but we can't pretend it didn't happen." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I am trying to pretend it didn't happen. I want to forget it. I want to move on." Ryan's gaze softened, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I understand, but I think you're punishing yourself more than you need to. It happened. We made a mistake. But beating yourself up over it isn't going to make it go away." I swallowed hard, his words hitting me in a way I wasn't prepared for. "Maybe you're right," I whispered, feeling the weight of the guilt settle over me again. "But I have to live with what I did. I can't just forget." Ryan looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." I didn't respond, couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of our conversation hanging heavy in the air. As I walked back to my desk, I knew I couldn't let Ryan's words get to me. I had made a promise to myself to move on, to be the wife Mike deserved, and that was the only thing I needed to focus on. As the weeks went on, the pressure of keeping my secret began to take its toll. Every interaction with Mike felt like a test, like I was constantly waiting for him to figure out what I had done. My anxiety spiked every time we had a conversation, every time we shared a meal or went to bed together. It was as though I was living in a constant state of fear that Mike would look at me and know. I became more distant, despite my efforts to stay close to him. I'd catch myself pulling away when he tried to hold my hand, or zoning out when he talked about his day. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the concern. He was trying so hard to be patient with me, to understand what was going on, but I knew he couldn't understand. Not when I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. One night, it all came to a head. Mike and I were sitting at the dinner table, the kids already in bed, when he put his fork down and looked at me, his expression serious. "Sarah," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I can't keep pretending like everything is okay. You've been acting different, and I don't know why, but it's scaring me. I don't want to lose you, but I feel like I already am." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment when he would confront me, when the weight of my guilt would come crashing down. I don't know what to say," I stammered, trying to hold back the tears that were already threatening to spill. "Tell me the truth," Mike said quietly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and desperation. "What's going on? What are you hiding from me?" I felt like I was about to break, like the walls I had built to keep the truth hidden were crumbling before my eyes. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to confess everything, to unburden myself and beg for his forgiveness. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to shatter his trust, to destroy the life we had built together. I'm just stressed. I lied, my voice trembling. Work has been overwhelming, and I guess it's been affecting me more than I realized. Mike didn't look convinced. Is that really it? I nodded, forcing a weak smile. Yeah, I'm sorry I've been distant. I'll try to do better. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. But he didn't push any further. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand. Okay, he said softly. I just want you to be okay. I love you, Sarah. The guilt surged through me like a tidal wave, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. I love you too, I whispered. But the words felt hollow, weighed down by the secret I was still keeping. As we cleared the dishes and got ready for bed, I knew I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a prison of my own making. Something had to change. But whether I could bring myself to tell Mike the truth, or whether I would let it eat me alive, was a decision I wasn't sure I was ready to make. The days after Mike's confrontation were some of the hardest I had ever experienced. The weight of my lie pressed down on me, suffocating any attempt at normalcy. I told myself that I could keep going like this, that I could push the guilt down far enough for it to disappear. But I was wrong. It was only getting worse. Mike had given me the space to open up, to be honest, and I had lied to him. Every moment we spent together now felt like I was betraying him all over again. Every smile he gave me, every time he said, "I love you," felt like a dagger to my chest. I had thought the guilt would fade with time. I had thought that, by keeping the affair a secret, I was protecting our marriage. But the truth was, I wasn't protecting anything. I was slowly destroying us from the inside. One night, about a week after our conversation at dinner, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. I looked tired, worn out, as though the weight of the secret was physically draining me. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to snap myself out of the spiral, but it didn't help. I felt trapped in my own body, trapped in the consequences of my mistake. I dried my face and walked back into the bedroom, where Mike was already asleep. I watched him for a moment, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I had betrayed the person who loved me most in the world. He was lying there, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me, and I felt a deep, overwhelming sadness settle over me. I couldn't keep living like this. I climbed into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, and lay there staring at the ceiling. I felt the tears welling up in my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I let them fall. I cried silently, the guilt pouring out of me in waves, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling even more exhausted than before. Mike was already downstairs with the kids, making breakfast, and I could hear their laughter drifting up from the kitchen. Normally, that sound would have brought me joy. But today, it just reminded me of how far I had fallen. I needed to make a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, hiding from the truth and pretending that everything was fine. But I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to tell Mike the truth. I wasn't sure if I could bear to see the look on his face when he found out. It took me a few more days to work up the courage. The decision weighed heavily on me, but I knew I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I had to tell Mike, no matter how much it hurt, no matter what it cost me. I couldn't keep living in this purgatory of guilt and fear. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat Mike down in the living room. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was it. There was no turning back now. Mike, I began, my voice shaky. There's something I need to tell you. Something I've been hiding from you for a long time. He frowned, looking confused. What is it? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling in my lap. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Mike's expression shifted, concern mixing with fear. What are you talking about? I couldn't look him in the eye. I stared at the floor, my voice barely above a whisper. At the company party, something happened. I crossed a line. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel Mike's eyes on me, the weight of his confusion and shock pressing down on me. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low, but steady. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say the words that had been eating away at me for months. I was with someone else, one of my coworkers. I kissed him, and it went further than that. Mike's face drained of color, and I could see the pain flicker across his features. He stood up, pacing the room as he tried to process what I had just told him. I don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. Why would you do that? Tears filled my eyes as I finally looked up at him, the guilt and shame overwhelming me. I don't know, I whispered. It was a stupid, reckless mistake. I was drunk, and I wasn't thinking clearly. But that's not an excuse. I'm so sorry, Mike. I never wanted to hurt you. Mike stopped pacing and turned to face me. His eyes filled with a mixture of anger, hurt, and betrayal. Do you realize what you've done? You've destroyed everything. Our trust, our marriage. How am I supposed to forgive you for this? The words cut deep, but I knew I deserved them. I had shattered the life we had built together, and there was no taking it back. I know, I sobbed, tears streaming down my face. I know I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it, but I need you to know that it didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, and it's been eating me alive ever since. I love you, Mike. I love our family. Please, just give me a chance to make it right. Mike stared at me for what felt like an eternity, the hurt in his eyes piercing me to my core. Finally, he shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can. He walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my guilt, my regret, and the crushing reality of what I had done. The days after my confession were some of the hardest of my life. Mike barely spoke to me. He slept in the guest room, and the distance between us felt like a chasm that I couldn't cross. The house was eerily quiet, the kids unaware of the storm that had erupted between us. Every time I looked at Mike, I saw the pain in his eyes, and it killed me to know that I had caused it. I didn't know if he would ever forgive me. I wasn't sure if I deserved his forgiveness, but I knew I had to try. I couldn't give up on us, not after everything we had been through together. One evening, about a week after I had told him the truth, Mike finally sat down with me at the kitchen table. His expression was still filled with hurt, but there was also a calmness there that hadn't been present before. I've been thinking, he began, his voice steady but quiet. I don't know if I can ever forget what you did. It's going to take time, maybe a long time, for me to trust you again. But I do know that I still love you, and I don't want to throw away everything we've built because of one mistake. Tears filled my eyes as I listened to his words, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding through me. I love you too, I whispered, my voice shaking. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, Mike. I swear. He nodded, his eyes softening just a little. We'll take it one day at a time. But I need you to understand. Things are going to be different for a while. I nodded, knowing that I had a long road ahead of me. But the fact that he was willing to try, that he hadn't walked away, was more than I could have hoped for. As we sat there in the kitchen, the silence between us was no longer filled with dread. It was filled with the possibility of healing, of rebuilding what had been broken. We weren't fixed. We weren't healed. But we were still together, and for now that was enough. The days that followed our conversation were awkward and painful, but they also held a flicker of hope. Mike had said we'd take it one day at a time, but it was hard to know what that would look like. There was still so much distance between us, and I knew it would be a long time before things felt anything close to normal again. He stayed in the guest room for a while. It was a constant reminder of how far I'd pushed him away, and every night, as I lay in our bed alone, I felt the weight of the mistake I'd made pressing down on me. But he hadn't left. That mattered. He was still here, and for that I was grateful. We tried to resume normal life for the sake of the kids. We didn't fight in front of them. We didn't let them see how fragile everything had become between us. On the outside, everything looked the same. Two parents raising their children, going to work, going through the motions. But underneath, everything had changed. Mike had moments of withdrawal. Some days he'd barely speak to me. Other times he'd try to act like things were okay, like we were back to how we used to be. But I could tell that, no matter what, the betrayal lingered in his mind, just as it did in mine. We were both trying, but trying wasn't enough to erase the pain. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Mike and I found ourselves in the living room, sitting in silence. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. I could feel the tension in the air, the heaviness of all the things left unsaid. Finally, I spoke. Mike, I know things aren't going to be easy for a long time, but I just want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I'm not going to give up on us. He turned to look at me, his expression serious but not angry. I know you're sorry, Sarah, and I appreciate that you want to fix things. But right now, I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with all of this. You broke my trust, and that's not something I can just forget. His words stung, but I knew they were true. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. I understand, I said quietly. I'll be patient. I'll wait as long as you need. Mike nodded, and for the first time in days, he reached for my hand. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. It was a sign that, despite everything, there was still something between us worth saving. In the weeks that followed, Mike and I began to take small steps toward rebuilding trust. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were barely making any progress. But we were both committed to trying. We started going to counseling, something Mike had been hesitant about at first but eventually agreed to. Our therapist was patient and understanding, and she helped us start to unpack the complicated emotions we were both dealing with. There were times when the sessions were painful. Mike didn't hold back when talking about how much I had hurt him, and hearing the depth of his pain made the guilt resurface all over again. But it was also necessary. We couldn't heal if we didn't face the truth head-on. I don't understand how you could do it, Mike said during one session, his voice tight with emotion. You always said you loved me, that we were happy. So why did you let it happen? His question cut deep, and I had asked myself the same thing 1,000 times. I wished I had an answer that would make sense, but the truth was, there wasn't a clear reason. I don't know, I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. It was a moment of weakness, and I wasn't thinking about the consequences. But that doesn't change the fact that it was wrong, and I'm so sorry for what I did. Mike nodded, but I could see the pain still etched on his face. It's just hard to wrap my head around. I thought we had a good marriage, but now, I don't know. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. His words stung, but I knew they were honest. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just being truthful about how deeply the affair had impacted him. And I had to accept that. I had to give him the time and space he needed to process everything. A few months into counseling, something shifted between us. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't like we suddenly woke up one day and everything was better. But there was a quiet sense of progress, a slow thawing of the distance that had grown between us. One evening, after another difficult therapy session, Mike and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset. It had become a sort of ritual for us, a time when we could just be together without the pressure of fixing anything. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat in silence, letting the quiet moments stretch out between us. That night, though, Mike spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about trust," he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "About how it's something you build slowly over time, but it can be destroyed in an instant." I nodded, listening carefully. "I know. And I know I broke that trust." Mike glanced at me, his eyes softening just a little. "Yeah, you did. But I also see how hard you've been trying. I see that you're sorry. And I think maybe it's time for me to start letting go of some of the anger." His words surprised me. For so long, I had felt like we were stuck in a cycle of hurt and regret, but this felt like the first step towards something better. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm grateful that you're even willing to try." Mike sighed, leaning back in his chair and looking out at the horizon. "I still don't know how long it'll take for me to fully trust you again. But I do know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want to throw away everything we've built." I felt tears sting my eyes, but this time, they weren't from guilt or sadness. They were from hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The months that followed weren't perfect, but they were better. Mike and I had started to find a new rhythm, one built on honesty, patience, and a willingness to confront our feelings head-on. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when Mike would withdraw, when the hurt would resurface, and we'd have to work through it all over again. But we were getting better at navigating those moments together. We made a conscious effort to spend more time together. Real time, where we could focus on each other without distractions. We started going on date nights again, something we hadn't done in years. At first, it felt awkward, like we were trying to recapture something that had been lost. But over time, those moments began to feel more natural. We laughed again, talked about things other than the affair, and slowly, the tension between us started to fade. One evening, after a particularly good night out, Mike turned to me as we walked home and smiled. "I missed this," he said softly. I smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Me too." It wasn't a grand declaration of forgiveness, but it was something. It was progress. And in that moment, I realized that we were going to be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. We were both willing to fight for our marriage, and that was what mattered. As the months turned into a year, Mike and I had rebuilt something that was, in some ways, stronger than what we had before. The affair would always be a part of our story, a scar that would never fully disappear. But it didn't define us anymore. We had worked through the pain, the betrayal, and come out the other side with a deeper understanding of each other. One night, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars, Mike took my hand in his and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "I think I'm ready to forgive you." I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you sure?" He nodded, his expression calm and sincere. "Yeah, it's taken me a long time to get here, but I think holding on to the anger and the hurt isn't helping either of us. We've been through hell, but we've also worked hard to get back to where we are now. And I don't want to carry that burden anymore." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, overwhelmed with gratitude and love. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I can't tell you how much that means to me." Mike smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who had stood by me, even when I didn't deserve it. The man who had chosen to forgive, even when it would have been easier to walk away. "I love you, Sarah," he said softly. "I love you too," I replied, my heart full. And as we sat there under the stars, hand in hand, I knew that we had turned a corner. We weren't the same people we had been before the affair, but we were something new, something stronger. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was our story. And that was enough. Though Mike's forgiveness was something I had longed for, something I wasn't sure I would ever get, it was the first step in truly healing our relationship. However, Even with Mike's words of forgiveness, I realized there was still another hurdle I hadn't yet crossed: forgiving myself. Mike and I had worked hard over the past year to rebuild our marriage, and though it had taken time, we had managed to rediscover some of the closeness that we'd lost. But the weight of what I had done still lingered in my own heart. It was one thing for Mike to forgive me, but another thing entirely for me to let go of the guilt that had consumed me for so long. One afternoon, while cleaning out some old boxes in the attic, I came across a photo album from when Mike and I had first started dating. The pictures were filled with the joy and excitement of new love: road trips, beach days, dinners with friends. Flipping through those pages felt like stepping into a time machine, back to when everything was simpler, back before life had gotten so complicated. I stared at one photo in particular, a picture of us at the beach, laughing as the waves crashed at our feet. I barely recognized the carefree woman in the photo. She didn't carry the burdens I had carried in the last year, didn't know what it was like to nearly lose everything because of a single mistake. Tears filled my eyes as I closed the album. I missed that version of myself, the one who hadn't yet made a terrible decision that would haunt her for years. But I couldn't go back to being her. I had to figure out how to live with who I was now, the woman who had made mistakes, but also the woman who was learning from them, growing from them. That night, I sat down with Mike after the kids had gone to bed. We were sitting on the couch, the TV on in the background, but neither of us was paying much attention. I turned to him, my heart heavy with the need to say something that had been building inside me for a long time. "I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness lately," I said quietly. Mike looked at me, his eyes filled with curiosity but also understanding. "What about it?" "I know you've forgiven me," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "and I'm so grateful for that. But I'm still struggling to forgive myself. I've been carrying so much guilt, and it's like I don't know how to let go of it." Mike's expression softened as he listened. "You've been really hard on yourself, Sarah. I understand why, but you've also done everything you can to make things right. You're not the same person who made that mistake." I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. "I know, but it's hard. I hurt you so deeply, and I feel like I don't deserve to move on from it." Mike reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You do deserve it. You've been punishing yourself for so long, but at some point you have to let go. You made a mistake, but that doesn't define who you are now. I've forgiven you because I know you've learned from it. But you need to forgive yourself too." His words struck something deep inside me. I had been so focused on repairing our marriage, on earning back Mike's trust, that I hadn't realized how much I had been holding myself hostage to my own guilt. Mike was right. I couldn't keep punishing myself forever. I had to learn how to let go. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace start to settle over me. It wasn't complete, and I knew I still had work to do, but I was ready to start forgiving myself. As the months passed, things between Mike and me continued to improve. We had settled into a new normal, one that was built on honesty, communication, and a deeper understanding of each other. The affair had been a turning point for us, a breaking point, but also a moment of transformation. It had forced us to confront the things we had been ignoring in our relationship, the cracks that had formed long before the affair ever happened. We continued going to counseling, not because we were still struggling, but because we had found it helpful to keep the lines of communication open. It became less about healing from the affair and more about maintaining the closeness we had rediscovered. We didn't want to fall back into old habits, into the kind of complacency that had allowed us to drift apart in the first place. One evening, after a particularly productive counseling session, Mike and I went out to dinner. It felt like a celebration of how far we had come, of the progress we had made. As we sat at the table, laughing and talking, I realized that I hadn't felt this light in years. There was still work to be done, of course. Relationships are never easy, and marriage requires constant effort. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. At one point during the dinner, Mike looked at me with a smile that made my heart flutter, the same way it had when we had first started dating. "I'm proud of us," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I didn't know if we'd ever get back to this place, but here we are." I squeezed his hand, tears of gratitude welling up in my eyes. "I'm proud of us too. We've been through so much, but we didn't give up." He smiled, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence, holding hands, soaking in the peace that had finally settled between us. As time went on, I realized that Mike and I had built something new. Our marriage wasn't the same as it had been before the affair, but in many ways it was stronger. We had been forced to rebuild from the ground up, to tear down the walls that had come between us and create a new foundation. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and that made it worth fighting for. We began to share more of ourselves with each other than we ever had before. Our conversations went deeper, our connection stronger. There was a new level of intimacy between us, one that came from the knowledge that we had faced the darkest moments of our marriage and come out on the other side. One afternoon, as we were sitting on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, Mike turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about how we've changed, how I've changed." I looked at him, curious. "What do you mean?" "I think I used to take a lot for granted," he admitted. "I didn't always appreciate what we had, and I didn't realize how easy it was to let things slip away. But now, after everything, I feel like I see things more clearly. I don't want to take you for granted anymore. I want us to keep growing, to keep working at this." His words touched me deeply. It was the kind of conversation we hadn't had in the early years of our marriage, back when we assumed everything would just work out on its own. But we knew better now. We knew that love wasn't enough to keep a marriage strong. It required effort, intention, and a willingness to face the hard stuff together. "I feel the same way," I said, smiling softly. "We've learned a lot, and I think that's what's made us stronger." He nodded, pulling me into his arms as we watched the sunset together. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, we had rebuilt something beautiful, something lasting. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, I knew we would face them side by side. There were still moments when the memory of the affair would creep into my mind, moments of guilt, of regret. But they were fleeting now. They no longer held the same power over me as they once had. I had done the work, and I was continuing to do the work, to heal not just my marriage but myself. Mike and I talked about it occasionally, but not in the way we used to. It wasn't a source of pain anymore, but rather a reminder of how far we had come. We didn't dwell on it. We didn't let it define us. Instead, we focused on the future, on the life we were building together, one step at a time. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Mike turned to me with a small smile. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his tone light. "Maybe it's time we take a vacation, just the two of us." I laughed, the idea of a getaway sounding like exactly what we needed. "A vacation, huh? Where would we go?" He shrugged, his smile widening. "Anywhere. Somewhere warm. Somewhere we can just relax and be together." I grinned, leaning into him. I liked the sound of that. As we talked about possible destinations, I felt a sense of excitement bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just about the trip. It was about the fact that we were in a place where we could look forward to the future with joy, with hope. The affair was behind us now. It was a part of our story, but it wasn't the whole story. We had written new chapters since then, chapters filled with love, growth, and forgiveness. And as we planned our vacation, I realized that I had finally let go of the past. I had forgiven myself just as Mike had forgiven me. We had both learned that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about staying when things got hard, about choosing each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. We had chosen each other, and that was the greatest gift of all.